Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about what Christians mean by the words natural and unnatural, because it's very different than common usage. In common usage, the word natural refers to essentially like completely untouched by human beings, the way things are if they're human beings were never around, whereas unnatural means influenced by human beings, more or less, in common parlance. Is really completely unrelated to what Christians mean, because the Christian concept of natural, which is closely related to the ancient Greek concept of natural, refers to within the design of the world, the way things that were designed. So the way things are in their design for what they are supposed to be. So the easiest way to approach this is to look at human creations like tools. So if you look at a hammer as designed is going to have a hard part with weight rigidly attached to it on some sort of armature. That's what makes it a hammer by and large. There's some other variants of hammers where it's just weight with hardness, but talking the standard hammer, the way it's designed is to be like that. So it is, in analogous language, natural, in this sense that I'm talking about, for a hammer to be hard on the striking surface. It is natural for a hammer to have a rigid armature. It is natural for a hammer to have weight attached rigidly to the striking surface. If you have a hammer which is missing one of these things, so for example, the striking surface is soft, and I'm not talking like a wooden hammer, I'm talking like goat cheese, like soft cheese, soft. A lot of the soft cheese that I eat when I do is goat cheese, but I know they're hard goat cheeses. But I mean, like a soft cheese, that's unnatural for the hammer because that's not how it should be. And if when we're to do another thing, for example, that involves the concept of deterioration, so it gets a little bit closer, would be if the hammer were to badly rust, so that the striking surface was no longer hard, but now being a patchwork of ferrous oxide, would be very, very brittle. And when you strike with it, instead of transmitting all of the force in a very inelastic way, it would now crumble and would not transmit the force very well. In the sense I'm talking about of natural, it would be unnatural for the hammerhead to be made of ferrous oxide, rust. In a similar way, if the hammer were to, for example, have a thin striking surface and nothing behind it, like if you were to cut off the hammerhead and take just a thin millimeter-sized slice of the hammer and put it on the handle, again, this would be unnatural to the handle in the sense that I am talking about, because that is not what the hammer was designed to be. It is not a hammer in the manner that its creator made it to be. And what would happen here is, in this degenerate form, and we're getting here what unnatural means, in the degenerate form that I talked about, so you take the slice off, you cut off the head, and you glue it onto the handle. This would cease to be useful as a hammer. It would no longer be able to hammer nails in. It would have no weight behind the striking surface. If you made that thin enough, the striking surface wouldn't even be hard anymore. This is, again, by analogy, what is meant by unnatural. That is to say, it is no longer according to what it was made to be. So if you were to turn a hammer, for example, into a crowbar, so you were to take the hammer, say a claw hammer, right, and you were to heat it up, bend it so that it was now longer and flat, and then let it cool, it would now sort of be useful as a crowbar. It would no longer be a hammer. You couldn't really use it as a hammer, and as such you will have deformed it from being a hammer. But the other thing is you won't have turned it into a very good crowbar. Now, the metaphor breaks down horribly because you could, of course, just remelt the entire thing and recast it, or reforge it, even better, as a crowbar, in which case you could actually turn the thing into a viable crowbar. That's where the metaphor breaks down, because you can't do that with human beings. So when we talk about natural and unnatural, the concepts described in the hammer do come through into what is meant by natural and unnatural within a Christian framework. Natural, when a Christian is talking about what is natural, refers to how a human being was designed by God. Now, unnatural, before I proceed to fallen, unnatural refers to varying from that. Anything which varies from how the human being was designed to be is unnatural in that sense, because it is not nature. Nature being how things were created. Now, the thing is, nature is not static. There is not one moment of creation and then nothing changed since then. In fact, creation has been unfolding for quite a long time. So, we come to the problem of a thing can be created to be good, to have a particular nature, but it is then capable of degenerating. This is where we get the concept of sin, and this is where we get the concept of fallenness. We live in not a perfect world, nor an evil world, but a fallen world. A fallen world is a world that is still, in a sense, at its core good, was made to be good and has not completely lost that, but which has been damaged, which has degenerated, which is only partially natural, partially what it is supposed to be. So, when you look at the concept of fallenness, this resolves a lot of the problems that tend to not make sense within the sort of secular worldview that can either approve of something completely or disapprove of it entirely, but that's it. In fact, there are quite a lot of things in this world where you have to sort of approve of them, but not all of them. And that's really, really hard to do if you can only think of something as good or only think of something as evil. Or, still worse, heaven help you, think of things in terms of shades of gray, by which you mean basically that you just stop thinking about them entirely and then pick one of those two to act like it is, without having to justify it. I'm very, very cynical about the phrase shades of gray. There is a slightly less awful meaning of shades of gray, by the way, which is analogous to stippling in computers, if you're familiar with it. But the basic thing is, if you were to take a checkerboard of black and white, it looks like there are patches of black and patches of white. If you go far enough away, you can't tell the individual patches from each other, and so they average out, and instead of being white or black, it looks kind of gray. So when people talk about shades of gray, some people do actually mean that it's not that things are good, or things are both good and evil simultaneously, essentially violating the law of logic, but that you're not looking at them closely enough, and as such you're averaging together things that are different from each other, and so misunderstanding them. And so when people talk about shades of gray, some people, I don't think many, but I'm not sure about the exact numbers, actually mean that what you have to do is look closer to get clarity on an issue, because taking something that is an admixture of both good parts and bad parts and treating it as one thing produces very inaccurate results. Okay. Do I loathe the phrase shades of gray? Anyhow, so the thing about the fallen world is that it gives you both at once the ability to recognize what is good in things, especially when it comes to their potential, incidentally, and to distinguish what is bad in them, but to distinguish what is bad in them as not being essential to them. Because this is, again, where you get this problem of you get the good person versus bad person distinction, that a good person does good things and a bad person does bad things, and they're two completely different sorts of people, whereas, in fact, human beings are fallen. We do many good things. We are oriented towards the good, but we also all fail to greater and lesser extents. We don't all do good things. So we don't do only good things. And we don't do all the good things that we should, in fact, do, and so on. So what you have is the concept of fallenness, therefore, enables you to look at a person who is doing something wrong. And this is where the concept of separating the sin from the sinner comes from. Because if they are good but fallen, they have imperfections. But the thing is, the imperfections are not part of them. The imperfections are something that is making them less themselves. So, take the example of, say, a traitor. You can see this all over the place in movies. And when they're not the cardboard cutout, where you don't know anything about them, but a character who actually has a bit of depth to them, you get to like them, but then you discover they're a traitor, and this produces a lot of conflicting emotions. This is terrible in a number of ways. And so the conflict is resolved in understanding that the person in himself is good. The person was meant to be loyal, to be faithful. The person is capable of being loyal and being faithful. And the horrible thing, his treason, his traitorousness, his betrayal of his friends and comrades, or what have you, is something outside. But at the same time, this doesn't lead you into the trap of what's loosely called universalism. Universalism is the idea that everyone's just fine, or, well, everyone will eventually be fine. Within Christian soteriology is the term, talking about salvation. Universalism is the heresy that it really nothing actually matters. Everyone's just going to be saved no matter what they do. Everything's just going to be completely fine. There's no such thing as hell. Everything's great. This is kind of obviously wrong if you pay any attention to the world. But in any event, that is a temptation, because if you separate the sin from the sinner, love the sinner, hate the sin, you can be tempted to get to the point where you actually pretend that the sin has nothing to do with the sinner. And this is just obviously false if you actually have experience of the world. It, by and large, tends to seem to be the sort of thing that extremely comfortable people who don't really get exposed to much in the way of human evil can pull off. Mostly not people who actually have experience of it. But whichever way that goes, the problem of universalism is that pretending that the sin is just unrelated to the sinner, as if it's like something, like is. You can use the metaphor of sin as like dirt getting on someone to stain them, but it's not a very good metaphor because sin actually does affect us. And so if you go too far with that sort of metaphor, then you can sort of get the idea that all you have to do is, just brush the sin off, everything will be fine, and no problems at this point. But that's not how things work, because we are in every moment in time building ourselves up with everything we think, with everything we do, with everything we refrain from doing. We are building up what sort of person we are. In Aristotelian language, we are habituating ourselves. We're building up habits. The idea in Aristotelian philosophy is more than... it's fuller, it's deeper than the common concept of habit is in like, I'm in the habit of taking a shower every morning. That's not really, I mean, that's a little bit of what's meant. I'm in the habit of having a bowl of cereal for breakfast. I'm in the habit of catching the 8:10 train. Whatever exactly, like that concept of habit, it's related, it gets to it. And so, we'll use that for the moment. Just bear in mind that's not all that Aristotle meant. But so habituation has that sort of property to it that you build things up, and over time it gets easier to do the thing that you are habituated to. It gets harder to not do the thing that you are habituated to because you're so used to it, you feel its absence so much more, and so on. And that's the problem with sin. Sin actually, because it is real, I mean, it's as I stated in Good and Evil, sin is a privation of being. It's like a shadow, but nonetheless the non-existence of the being is real in that there isn't the being there. So sin is real, and so we form habits as we sin. The more, and in general, because sin and being unnatural are very, very, very closely related. The more we act unnaturally, the harder it becomes to act naturally, and the more easy it becomes to act unnaturally. Now, the big problem with this is, as I mentioned earlier, human beings are not infinitely malleable. Iron is infinitely malleable. You can melt it down and put it in any shape you want. And having done that, you can melt it down and put it in any shape you want again. And there you go. And no matter what shape you would put it into, you can melt it down and recast it. And if it gets rusty, you can use electrolysis to, with large amounts of electricity, you can reverse the rusting process. And and then you can, I don't want to go through all of it. It's a neat experiment. Take a rusty nail and put it in and use it as, I can't remember the cathode or the anode in a battery, but in water, and then you produce hydrogen gas, and iron, pure iron falls off. There are other ways of doing the same sort of thing. Of course, you can also do reduction reactions where you put a carbon source in the classic way. You take the iron that's been bound to something else, you put it in with carbon. And in anaerobic environment, you heat it up to several thousand degrees, and then the oxygen making the iron impure gets driven away enough that it can bond into the carbon, which it would rather be in, and then the iron becomes pure, and so that's how you purify the iron. So there's several ways in which even a rust reaction can be reversed, and you can purify the thing, and then you can melt it and cast it into any shape you want. Yet again, iron has the property of being infinitely malleable. Human beings aren't. Human beings can't turn into completely different things. You can't take a man and make him a dog. You can't take a man and make him a bird. You can't take a man and make him a earthworm. And in the same sort of way, you can't take a man and make him into something to whom sin is natural. You can't take a man who is made for telling the truth and turn him into something who is made for telling lies. You can't be made for telling lies. It's not a thing, so a human being can't become that thing. So as you tell more and more and more lies, you don't become a different thing, you just become less and less human. But you're not becoming some other thing that you are, now more. In the same way, if you, stop walking and trot around on all fours and go up and, sniff people in places they'd rather not be sniffed, you don't become a dog. You might remind people of a dog a little bit. You might, get kicked quite a lot, unlike a dog. But you're not becoming a dog. No matter how much you do this, you're not turning yourself into a dog. You're just ceasing to talk like a human being talks. You're ceasing to walk like a human being walks. So that is basically the problem, illustrated by way of metaphor, with being unnatural, with living according to the fallen part. You degenerate, you become less and less yourself, but you can't become something else. Didn't mean to hit the ficus there. But you can't become something else, and so all you sort of get left with is becoming less and less yourself. This, by the way, being the Christian concept of hell, that having turned away from the source of being, having turned away from what you are, there's no real other option. And so you simply become less and less until you sort of die permanently in that concept of hell, having turned completely and utterly away from the source of your being, that is God. So that's the concept of natural versus unnatural, its relationship to sin versus virtue, virtue being living naturally according to what you are. Being unnatural is anything else other than what you actually, when I say are, what I really mean is what you were made to be. Are in a final sense. The concept of telos, the natural end, the aim, the goal for which you were made, the thing you are supposed to become since you are building yourself up through time. That there's one thing you can actually really succeed in being, that is a human being fully alive, and nothing else is that thing. You can't become those things. You can only degenerate the further away you wander from being a human being fully alive. So, it applies absolutely everywhere. This basically underlies all concept of sin. It is obviously a radically different worldview from the sort of fundamental accidentalist, it's not a proper term, but view of the materialist, wherein nothing has an essence, everything just is accidentally whatever it happens to be. Still the case that human beings aren't very malleable, at least by experience, within a materialist worldview, simply because we're so complex. Likely, if you change anything, we just break. So, complex things still aren't very changeable. But it is the case within a materialist worldview that we could be turned into part of a shark, for example, by the shark eating us. I don't want to get into the materialist conception of consciousness. So anyway, but the point being, it is radically different. It is a complete departure. And this is why it's a complete failure to ever try to understand pretty much anything relating to Christian morality, Christian writing or talking on morality, Christian writing or talking on things like natural versus unnatural and so on in materialist terms. It's just the words themselves just mean radically different things, so that if a materialist is trying to look at what a Christian means by natural or unnatural or sin or even good or evil, the words just mean utterly different things than what the materialist, or naturalist, if you like that dodge, means by those words. So this is at least an outline, getting started of what a Christian means. I do recommend, by the way, there are Christian places to read it, but it's the problem is, for so long Christendom has had a standard education in Greek philosophy that a lot of the stuff is sort of assumed. So not often written about that much in a explicit Christian setting. You'll find some of this in C.S. Lewis. I can recommend, like he talks about it somewhat, at least in Mere Christianity, for example. Also, The Problem with Pain, The Four Loves, any of those. The Great Divorce, he talks about it somewhat explicitly in The Great Divorce. It's Great Divorce is an allegory, but it's really, really, really good. It's probably the best thing Lewis wrote. You can also find this concept, although in the Screwtape Letters, though the Screwtape Letters are a little bit in photographic negative. So it's not hard to read the Screwtape Letters, but you do have to bear that in mind, that since they're the advice of a one demon to another in how to try to trick a man into damning himself, everything that he calls good is bad, and everything he calls bad is good. Anyway, so you can find it there, or especially in the modern context, I really recommend going to Plato. Not always easy to read Plato in a modern context, I will grant, but hey, he wasn't Christian, so no one has to worry about him trying to trick you into being Christian or something, if it's the sort of thing people worry about. So any of those sources are really good ones. I strongly recommend Plato's Republic. Plato's dialogues are, of course, somewhat easier as a starting point to get into Plato. And Plato being difficult for several different reasons, but I'm told the Alan Bloom translation of Plato's Republic, by the way, is one of the best. And so anyway, places, if you're interested in this concept of natural, I really recommend investigating it in Greek philosophy. I'm not nearly as well read in Aristotle as I should be. I've read very, very little Aristotle, more stuff about Aristotle and his philosophy than actually Aristotle. So I can't make good recommendations in terms of reading up in Aristotle. But heck, I just really I suspect I'd like Plato better even when I get around to reading Aristotle, though Aristotle is very, very valuable to read, and someday I will. So good reading if you're interested for more on the subject, to get that sense of it. You can also get some similar things, by the way, in if you look at Chinese Taoist literature. I personally like this stuff written by Chuang Tzu best. But anyway, you can Chuang Tzu, or Zhuang Tzu, you sometimes see it written, had some really interesting stuff that's very, very, very similar, though phrased extremely differently. And since it's phrased very differently, it might work better for some people than for others. But you can see the similar sorts of concepts in the idea of natural versus unnatural there, like in the story of Chef Ding, which I recommend looking up. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.